Welcome, folks, and in today's lesson, we're going to talk about the subject of biodiversity. That's a very important concept in ecology and ecosystems, and it relates to the genetic or species diversity in an area or an ecosystem. And in order to do that, we're going to introduce you to a well-known species that exists in many different parts of the world. Certainly in Canada and in Ontario, there's lots of them. There's over 5,000 species on the planet. They're extremely important. And we're going to, well, let's see if you can figure out in the next 10-15 seconds what that organism is. The species in question is called hopper. And so we're going to use hopper as a way to discuss why biodiversity is important, what these creatures can add to an ecosystem, how various other creatures depend on them, what methods we've used to help these creatures, and just general topics such as that. So we're going to be having that discussion while talking about hopper. Hopper is a frog. It's not too important what type of frog that hopper is right now, just doing the eyes right now and the feet, and then I'll add a little bit of color, and then we'll get straight to our discussion. Now, frogs are very important in ecosystems. They are what is referred to as indicator species. An indicator species, as defined by the Encyclopedia Britannica, is an organism whose presence, absence, or abundance reflects an environmental condition. So what does that mean? Well, you can think of an indicator species almost like a signal that all is well in an ecosystem. When we have problems with our indicator species, that basically means that there's a problem with the ecosystem, and it may be like a red light signal that something is not well. And because amphibians and frogs are a type of amphibian because they can live on water or land, because they live on both water and land, they are very powerful indicator species. So when all is well with an amphibian or and so on, you would hope to see a you know a green signal. And basically what that means is that all is well in the pervading ecosystem. And likewise, if there's problems with that, the population of this amphibian, and then it's starting to go into the orange, or that signal is even starting to show red signs, and alarm bells are ringing, then that shows that maybe there's a problem, a bigger problem with the ecosystem, because it could cover the land and the water part. So frogs are indicator species, but what else do they do? What when we talk about these terms that are important in ecology, we could say, what is a frog's niche? What's its role? What does it actually do? Well, one of the things that frogs do is they control the insect population, and those little insects, they don't really stand a chance once the frogs start getting into eating mode. So they control those insect populations. They're also a food source for larger animals, and of course, one of those animals that like to snack on frogs, being ourselves, of course. In some parts of the world, eating frogs as a delicacy is something that's definitely done. And, we know of certain parts of the world where that's de rigueur, let's say. The other thing that they do is they secrete weird substances through their skin. And that has led, very recently, it's led to, a lot of breakthroughs in terms of using antibiotics and new medicines, which is a really interesting new area that they're used in. According to an article published in the Telegraph in 2010, a team in United Arab Emirates have recently identified 100 new antibiotics, including one that could fight the hospital superbug MRSA. And a quote from the biochemist that's working there, Dr. Michael Conlon, said that frog skin is an excellent potential source of antibiotic agents, and primarily because the secretions are so unique and in some cases toxic and poisonous, but in many very, very worthwhile and unique and possibly useful to us humans. So we know that frogs like hopper are massively important to the functioning of the universe. And there's approximately 5,000 species of known frogs on the planet. Now, hopper, as we talked about previously, could be any one of those frogs. It could be any of those frogs. It could look different. It could maybe be yellow. It could have certain little marks on there. Could have certain little spots on there. It could spend most of its time in a tree, most of its time in the water. So it could be any one of those 5,000 frogs. But no matter what type of frog it is, it has a very important role to play in ecosystems, that's for sure. Now, regardless of what type of frog it is, we know a couple of things that it will be for sure. It will definitely be a frog that most likely lives in water and on land, and that makes it something called an amphibian. And if we look at a chart here, so the question is how the amphibians are doing. And this is a report from Wild Species 2010, which I got from the Government of Canada website, just so we can have a look at how they're doing. In general, if you look at this graph, it gives the number of amphibian species. Now, what we're interested in, I guess, primarily is in Ontario. But if we look at it broadly speaking through different provinces, you can see that there's a couple of different levels of how the species are doing. Now, when we're talking about the health of a species, we want the species to be secure, and so it starts from a very, very healthy population of species. And as we move up this table, the species is getting more and more threatened. The population is reducing more and more. So when we see species from, let's say, yellow upwards, we know that we have some problems. So, for example, we see that quite a few of the species in Ontario have issues, and we can see that for example in BC there's a growing problem with the population of amphibians also. So that is a key worry based on some of the things that we know that amphibians are doing for us and general health of ecosystems. So we're going to assume that our frog hopper is a northern leopard frog. So let's just make that assumption, and we're going to look at some data about the northern leopard frog. So there is our lovely creature, old hopper up here. And if we just assume that hopper is a northern leopard frog, and we're going to look at the graph on the right, and this is a graph again from the Government Canada website. And what it's looking at is the total number of encountered northern leopard frogs over a period of time from 2007 to 2011. And it's in graphical format, and we can see that we're looking at the adult frogs and the egg masses, so two different metrics. And if we look at the adult frog numbers, we see that they're quite low, really low, because we're looking at starting at 35, and then as we move towards 2011, so right at the end at this point here, we can see that the numbers are down around 10. So the northern leopard frog is definitely an endangered species, almost extinct. And the good news is there are some major plans being put in place by various conservation groups to try and reintroduce this species into other parts of BC where it used to live before. So this is something that's badly needed. It's critically endangered. There's only 17 to 39 breeding females at the main part where they are found. And it's also got this growing problem of BD. So maybe we can use the conversation of BD to develop that conversation of how humans are involved in this biodiversity issue a little more. So, a lot of creatures around the world, particularly amphibians, are coming under pressure from this fungus, which has an unwieldy name that I won't even attempt to pronounce, but it's on screen, and its shortened form is BD. Now, this is a flesh-eating fungus. It's a horrific fungus that actually eats away at the flesh of amphibians, including frogs like hopper. And it has condemned a huge amount of species to extinction. So it is a massive problem. If you think about major epidemics, pandemics in the last 150 years, we look at Spanish flu 100 years ago, which wiped out millions and millions of lives, and various other huge diseases that have wiped out different species of animals. If we look at those, they pale in comparison to this. It's condemned more species to extinction than any other pathogen. And in actual fact, it's led to the decline of 501 amphibian species and led to 90 species to extinction. And that's from an expert in this field, Ben Shiel, from the Australian National University. So you can see the scope of the issue, of the problem. Now, how did this BD, this fungus, this flesh-eating fungus, how did it come to be? Well, it originated in Asia. And what happened was it originated there, and then it was spread throughout the world. And that may have happened unintentionally, but it would have happened on ships, and in some cases maybe it happened intentionally through the movement of animals by human beings. But suffice it to say that humans have played a major part in the spread of this BD fungus, which otherwise would have been more contained. And the impacts have been enormous. This is an image that I got from National Geographic, captured by Matthew Fisher, and it shows a large amount of frogs which have been decimated by this BD fungus. And that's just one of the ways, through carrying and through movement, that we've managed to move this major problem all around the world into different ecosystems and affected different amphibians in a major way. So if we take a look at the kingdoms of life, we see many things. We see that the world itself, left unfettered, has many kingdoms. Beautiful different kingdoms and ways of classifying different things. And this is, a visual chart from Encyclopedia Britannica that seeks to, it just shows the level of diversity of species, which is a measure, variety of species, a measure of the biodiversity of the planet. And we can see that, for example, there's relatively speaking, a huge number of plants in the universe, and quite a large number of bacteria. And we can also see that our position down here as humans is quite small, inconsequential in terms of biomass, in terms of our, how much mass we take up in the world in comparison to anthropods and so on. We have a very small biomass. But the problem is that lately, primarily lately, we've been tending to move towards this sort of a situation here, where the Homo sapien at the top of the tree is starting to have a lot of a negative impact in terms of different ecosystems, different wildlife. And if we're not careful, the positives that we can do will be totally eclipsed by the negatives that we can do. So even though we have a small biomass load in the universe, our impact, our footprint is enormous, and it's growing all the time. So our challenge is to reverse this over the next couple of years. So what are some of those human activities that threaten biodiversity? Now, I'm speaking primarily through the lens of hopper and the frogs and amphibians here. So some of these activities that would threaten biodiversity are the draining of wetlands. This is, there are many different reasons why we might do this. One of the reasons would be to create dams. Also increase polluting. Again, there's many different ways that we would increase polluting here. And we talked before about herbicides and pesticides. They would be an extremely bad thing to introduce to an ecosystem in terms of amphibians. Land clearing and mining, searching for those precious metals and oil and gold and so on. That has an enormous repercussion in terms of the tailings and the pollutants that are kicked into this ecosystem. The removal of crop residue. Now, crop residue would be the leftovers from crop that the amphibians find quite useful. And that's removed through burning and so on for farming, and that leaves a big effect also. The introduction of exotic species. So examples of exotic species. Well, one example would be actually the bullfrog. So this would be a predator species that would feed on the northern leopard frog, for example, and also some fish, bass would feed on it too. And the construction of barriers. Well, an example of a barrier here would be a road or a highway. This would be a good example of where, if there's a frog over here, it would struggle maybe to get to the other side and would be displaced from the rest of its community. So it would slice that ecosystem in half, perhaps. So humans have done a lot to threaten biodiversity and maybe forgotten about our place, our exalted place in the universe. So just to recap on biodiversity and some of the things that it gives us are on screen here. It gives us, well, enormous pleasure and inspiration in terms of, artistic endeavors and that joy of seeing a frog hopping along a footpad or a grass meadow or hopping along a tree is a sight to behold. Also, it provides us with so many different varieties of food. It also has in the past given us so much in terms of medicine. For certain countries around the world, ecotourism is a massive boon to the economy. So for a huge number of reasons, including the security and stability of the universe, biodiversity is very, very important, and we've got to remember our position within that ecosystem and within that large community. And through conservation groups and through just individual efforts, such as making conscious decisions on, where your food comes from and how much packaging you're using and so on, we can begin to reverse this trend of biodiversity. Which has been moving towards less biodiversity, and start protecting those areas of large biodiversity and bringing species back into places where they should be. And so humans have the power to reverse this change and trend and make sure that we continue to foster and grow biodiversity to ensure that we have a healthy planet moving forward. So if you like this video, make sure to give it a wee thumbs up and make sure that you are always keeping in the back of your minds the importance of biodiversity and our place on the planet.